Hello everybody, I'm Timotheus, the Rogue Theologian, and I want to apologize ahead of time for the rawness of today's video. It's my first ever video, so it's going to be raw, unedited, and it's going to be a humble beginning, but everything does, doesn't it? Speaking of beginnings, that's what we're talking about today, chapter 1 of Genesis, as we build our rogue theology. Rogue theology here meaning a kind of theology you're just not taught in Sunday school. You're certainly probably not taught it in sermons, at least not any sermons I've really ever heard. And so we're going to call it rogue theology because it sits outside of the theology you're usually taught in church. However, it is something that is orthodox. It does fall under Orthodox Christianity, and it is pretty ecumenical, so whichever tradition you come from, for the most part, it should fit neatly inside of that. So this is what theology teaches us. If you go to study theology, this is what you would find. And without further ado, let's get into it. So the chapter of Genesis that talks about the creation, that very first chapter, is what we call a creation myth. And if you study other ancient cultures, you'll find that just about every ancient culture had their own unique creation myth. And if you read a lot of them, you'll actually start to see a lot of similarities. They had a very similar form, a very similar function. A lot of them said a lot of similar things. However, the Hebrew one, the one that we find in our Bible, does set apart from all the others for good reason. So that's what we're going to talk about. Just remember, creation myths were a thing that was a form of story that was told around the campfire, around the house. It was their form of entertainment. You know, instead of sitting in front of a TV and watching a TV show together or watching a movie, this was their form of storytelling. And so this would be something that was told not just for entertainment, but it was also told to describe who they were as a people, what their culture was, and where they were going as a people. What was the point of everything around them? That's what a creation myth was. And a lot of stories built on top of that. So when we get to chapter 1 of Genesis and start reading it, we also need to understand the structure in which that story was, because it was done a little bit different back then. This is what you would expect to see out of a typical story. And oops, looks like I set it down in something. I apologize for the whatever that is. But anyway, a typical story starts with the beginning, kind of telling you what the story's about. Chapter 1, setting, hero, characters, conflict, whatever. So it starts with a thesis. It kind of rises to a climax in the story, and then drops down right at the end to the epilogue once the conflict is resolved. That's what we normally see in a story. That's what we expect to see. And pretty much all stories these days are told like this. However, there was another form called a didactic back in those days, and it was a little more circular, and I want to kind of show you what I mean by that. A circular didactic basically would have an abstract point to it hidden somewhere inside of it. And so the best way they found to tell it was to kind of work around it. So today's version of the didactic, there were other didactics that went circularly in different patterns, but today's didactic specifically we're going to be talking about is one that goes one way to what we would call a pseudo climax, kind of a halfway climax, drop back down at the beginning, come back to the epic climax of the story, and then leave through the epilogue. So that's what we're going to talk about. That's the one that they used in Genesis 1. Remember, the main point of the story, because it's a didactic, is hidden inside here. It's a hidden gem. It's in a nut. You know, we got to open up that shell. So that's what we're going to do. Genesis 1 starts off with its thesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It tells us what this whole story is about. And then there's an inciting incident. Now, in most stories, the inciting incident is what propels the story forward, usually through the conflict. But in this particular story, it started when God creates light. He says, let there be light. And then he separates the light from the darkness, creating the realm of light and darkness. Okay? Next, he separates the sky from the water, creating the realm of sky and water, right? Finally, he creates the land by separating the land out of the water. All right, so in the first half, we reach our pseudo climax right here, and that's when he creates the land. And now we have a key to that. We know this is a climax because in the beginning, God created light. Then he goes about separating things. But then when he reaches that climax on that third day, he does that again. He creates something brand new. He creates plant life. That, to the ancient people, was an indicator oh, the story's getting a little bit more interesting. So this is our pseudo-climax. So it becomes what we call a placeholder for our second climax. We go back to the beginning. God creates heavenly bodies to rule over the realm of light and darkness, the one he created on the first day. He creates things to rule over that. So then he creates birds and fish, and that's to rule over the second realm he created, and that's the sky and the water. Then he finally makes animals to rule over the land. But now we're on a climax again, so we're going to go a little bit further. We're going to do something a little more interesting. Well, God created mankind, created him in his own image. And by mankind, we mean both men and women. He created the male and female. In this part of the story, he creates both men and women on the sixth day. That's important to remember. So he creates mankind. He says, hey, I want you guys to master all that I've created. I've made you after me. You get to master it all. Now, implicit in that is not just the land, but he also wants us to master the sky and the water. And even more implicit than that, not directly said, perhaps even the lights, the bodies that rule the light and the dark. Okay? For sure these, because he says, subdue the earth, master the earth. But the language is used to say, master what I just created. Okay? So, for sure this, maybe that, which is pretty exciting if you think about it in terms of where we sit in humanity today. All right. So our story does this. It meets the climax of mankind being created to dominate the earth. Now, we want to point out something very, very important. At this point, we're told, God says it's good. It's a perfect paradise. He's created everything exactly how he wants. But even then, there's some conflict being introduced to us. Mankind is created, and he's created to master things that he cannot create. And I say he in the generic sense, all right? He can barely suit his own needs, doesn't necessarily master the earth yet, and water, he doesn't have a boat yet, he can't master the seas yet, doesn't for a while, and really only in the last century and a half have we even begun to master the sky itself. So it's worth noting, at this point in the story, there's conflict. Even in perfect paradise, there are obstacles to overcome. But then there's another thing too. When he creates mankind, he tells the animals, he doesn't tell the plants, he tells the animals and man, I give you all the plants as your food. He does not say you can eat each other. There is no carnivore mentioned. And so a hook is created in our story, a hook saying, wait a minute, there's a question here. Wait a minute, I look around me and I don't always eat just vegetables. I eat meat, and there's carnivores that go around and they eat meat. People eat meat, animals eat meat, but he said we can only eat plants. What happened? It's meant to be a hook for our sequel, right? Like we do in our stories today. Watch a story, gets towards the end, they close up all the loose ends, except they leave a couple hanging just to let us know, hey, we're planning on there being more to the story than that. So then it goes into our epilogue, having met our thesis again. So this is the bigger circle to it. It's gone full circle. They said God created the heavens and the earth in the beginning. Here God has created the heavens and the earth, and now he has rested. So that's where our epilogue ends. It ends having introduced the setting, the conflict, and the characters of the rest of the epic of the Bible. So it has set itself up just like we'd expect to see in any story, with the classic structure, which we will see the whole Bible does with our thesis. Our first chapter, our characters, our conflict, and our setting have been set. And now it's going to make a classic story structure. But anyway, I also want to add, while we're talking about this, that structure was for an abstract point. It was not meant to be a literal story of a literal 7 days. It is difficult to imagine, upside down. It's difficult to imagine God created light and darkness, but that light wasn't in the form of a sun, or that darkness wasn't an absence of light, and how it got separated without being a body, a heavenly body, because the heavenly body wouldn't be created until day 4. There's other issues if you really want to think about it. For instance, God creates man on day 6, man and woman, both on day 6. But then we're going to go on and tell a story that seems to contradict that a little bit. It makes it a little bit difficult to understand if we hear that whole story in chapter 2 about Adam being told to name the animals, find a helper. No helper was found amongst the entire of the animal kingdom all in one day. He took a nap somewhere in that day and then woke up and there was a woman still on the 6th day. Maybe not. But the point was never to be a literal story. It used the structure of a week because it was an easy one to talk about. It suited the didactic form quite nicely. But the abstract point was God can do whatever he wants. He doesn't have to degrade himself into sordid behaviors to create the universe. And there's a call to adventure that all mankind has to become masters over the earth. And I find it really sad between the creationists and the evolutionists debating each other, fighting each other, particularly the creationists. Really frustrates me to see them use that story against the evolutionists. Science is a thing that's just trying to do what we're called to do, and that's master the world around us, understand nature, understand how things work. And if we don't allow each other to pursue that, then we're impeding our own selves to our own call from the Creator himself, and that is to master the world that he put us in. So if we can remember that story is meant for pointing out an abstract point, the abstract point being that we were created to master the nature that we were placed in by the Creator himself, and that Creator did not have to be a God who pleases himself or resorts to some sordid activities. And that's what we really need to keep in mind. We really need to keep in mind that when we read chapter 1, we're seeing a beautiful structure, a beautiful story that calls us to adventure. It's our call to adventure, to master the world around us. And we're given that call by the Creator himself. And that's okay. That's still perfect paradise. When we're doing that, we're fulfilling our function even as we existed back before the fall of man. So I hope you found this enlightening where there was blindness, and I hope this brings light where there was darkness. God bless.